feet all the way down so they don't swing. Good evening. Welcome to Good Shepherd for our second installment of Leading the Conversation. Tonight, I am joined with the Moorhead Police Chief, Shannon Monroe, and also Dr. Erin Sumala-Folkerts, who is a wellness coordinator and a embedded counselor in the police department. And also, full disclosure, he is my husband as well. Yes,
Yeah.
I put that out there just as we begin.
There's not a lot of Sumala Folkerts in the world, right? So
No, it's not
yeah.
a common name. But tonight we want you to be a part of this conversation too. We hope that you will be commenting on Facebook, lifting up your questions, and I will do my best to field some of these questions throughout our conversation. And I know it could go in a lot of different directions, and we can't solve all the problems of the world tonight. But I really do look forward to the ways that we can engage together as a community. The reason we started doing these Leading the Conversation events is because we want to engage important issues in our community. We want to see how we as Christians, as people of faith, can engage, understand, be a part of solutions, and also be the kind of neighbors that Jesus called us to be. Last month, when we had our first Leading the Conversation event, I interviewed Mayor Jonathan Judd, and he talked about being uncomfortable addressing the topic of race. And we put it out there that it's uncomfortable to talk about prejudice and racism, but we invited all of our viewers to be uncomfortable with us, to wade into the important conversation about race. And tonight we're going to be talking about our Moorhead Police Department. And recently, the police have been in the news for all sorts of reasons and for a lot of divisive reasons. There have been topics of protests and police brutality and police reform and what that might look like. Words like defund the police have come up. But what we want to focus on here tonight is some positive ways that our own police department is engaging our community and is tending to the mental health of the police officers who are in our community. We want to find ways that we can understand one another and have positive solutions that we can all participate in together as a community. Next month, we will be exploring another topic, and we invite you in the future, if you want to place your comments in Facebook, about topics that you would like us to address that face our community as well. I want to begin our time together by praying for our time together. Dear God, I thank you for being part of the most important things of life, for being with us as we talk about difficult things and important things. We pray that you would give us wisdom. We pray that we could find nuance. We pray that we could find empathy and understanding. And I pray that you would bless this time that we have together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
By way of entering into our conversation tonight, I wanted to ask each of you how you got into your field of work. So, Chief Monroe, how did you find your way into law enforcement? What is your story?
Well, I grew up in a small town, Waban, Minnesota, which is north of Detroit Lakes, and I am part Native American myself, and Waban is in Mahnomen County. It's entirely within the White Earth Reservation, so I grew up going to school with mixed race and some diversity in the school system, and I actually went off to college for business. So I had gotten my degree in business management and realized that I didn't want to be sitting in a cubicle counting cash registers or whatever for my job. I thought I wanted to do something more in my life, and I had thought about law enforcement off and on for many years. I did have some people that were close by in my neighborhood that worked in law enforcement that were kind of my role models. Sheriff Spickard, who's passed away now, and then Deputy Paul Bram was down the road from me a little way. So I kind of watched them and their careers and thought, I'm interested in that. I just wasn't sure. And I started to check into it more and more. I finished my degree in business management and then went on to Alexandria Technical College, getting into law enforcement. I really felt it was probably kind of like you. It was kind of a calling that you had, that I felt like I had something to offer the community, and I wanted to have a life worth meaning, and that's what kind of drew me into it.
And how did you find your way into your current role? Is there, I'm sure there's twists and turns, but that's also what makes things meaningful as well.
Well, I finished the law enforcement degree at Alexandria, and then the Shooting Star Casino was opening back in Mahnomen, which is my home area, and I got on as security there when the brand new building opened up. And then while I was there, there was an opening in the sheriff's department, and I started as a jailer and dispatcher, then moved on to being a part-time deputy, and did boat and water patrol, and my part-time status often was many times into 80, 90, 100 hours every 2 weeks because it was just so busy. From there was an opening up here in Moorhead, and when I had looked at my career at that time, where would I want to work? I kind of had this band like from Moorhead to like Duluth. I wanted to stay somewhere in northern Minnesota where I was close to the lakes and stuff. And my wife is originally from West Fargo, so she was telling me, yes, you should apply for Moorhead. And I put in the application, went through their process. I remember getting my letter in the mail. It said, congratulations, you are 12th on the list. And I remember throwing it in the garbage going, well, I'm never going to hear from them. Because at that time, there was literally 300 people applying for jobs. So it was hard to come by. So I can say I'm a 12th round draft pick. I got on with the department. Actually, Grant Whalen, who was the chief at the time, he was a sergeant, but he called and my wife answered the phone and accepted the job for me on the phone. So that's how I got here.
Smart wife.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So then just through, I guess hard work and right timing, and made my way through my career with various different assignments from investigations to SWAT. I did some instructor work within the department, and then a few different promotions, and ended up as chief in July of 2018.
All right. And we've invited both of you here because our hope is to talk about attending to the mental health of police officers and law enforcement. And your role has been recently created in the Moorhead Police Department, but what brought you into the career of mental health?
Yeah, so I've had a very strange career, as you know. I've done a lot of different things, but to kind of focus more on working with first responders, sort of my origin story with that, I think it really started with getting my EMT license in college. That was way back in 1998, and that's something that I've always kept up. And then I worked for a year or so as a volunteer EMT at Xcel Energy Center, working wild games and other events at the Energy Center there, and worked a lot with St. Paul Police. And so that was the first time that I started working, professionally in some way with police officers, and was just very impressed with the work that they did and enjoyed our conversations. So that's something that I always kept up through the years. And then I spent a year when we were in Chicago working as a trauma chaplain on the south side at a major hospital, Christ Medical Center, and worked a lot with police officers there and heard a lot of their stories as well, and the experiences that they had. And then when we moved to southern Minnesota for us to take our first pastor jobs, way back in 2007, I joined the local ambulance squad and was a first responder for our community. And so we worked with police officers all of the time. The sheriff's department especially, they were the first ones on scene. And they often would be radioing us and telling us what to expect, all of that. So again, got more and more interested in the work that police officers do and first responders in general. Then fast forward to moving here into Moorhead. I got my master's degree in mental health counseling when we were down in southern Minnesota at Mankato, Minnesota State Mankato, and then working on my doctoral degree and worked at Prairie St. John's and worked with police officers there. Learned about mental health, the role that police officers play in caring for people in mental health crises. So learned more there. And then fast forward to working at Christ the King here in Moorhead, and this would have been about 2016. A letter came around just from the police department, from the Moorhead Police Department, asking if anybody would be interested, pastors would be interested in working as a volunteer chaplain. So I answered the letter and entered into conversation with the police department and started in winter of 2016 as a volunteer chaplain. Meanwhile, finished my doctoral degree in counseling, and then moved into counselor education. So I taught at University of Mary, and now I'm teaching at Minnesota State University Moorhead. And as I moved into my education in mental health counseling, got my license as a marriage and family therapist, entered into more conversations with Chief Monroe and Captain Swenson at the department about moving into a wellness coordinator embedded counselor position. And so it's amazing. It's kind of a circuitous route to taking this position, but then officially started this past April in that role. So it's a part-time position, around 5 to 8 hours, caring for the mental health of our police officers at the police department.
So how did this program get started to have an embedded counselor with the Moorhead Police Department? And is this a common program? Do other police departments have this? Share a little bit about getting to this point of having this need or seeing this opportunity.
Okay, in becoming the chief here, one of the things I was looking at was the President's 21st Century report on policing. And one of the pillars was officer wellness. So I was already thinking about what we could be doing better in the department for officer wellness, with that belief that if you have healthy officers, that equals better service. So in the meantime, I'd just become chief, and then we had some incident happen within the Moorhead Police with one of our own staff who was arrested for a DUI. And in the aftermath of that, we found that we should have been doing more for this person. It was a fantastic employee who had 20 years on the department, had spent a number of years working juvenile, physical, and criminal sex crimes on children. And when he got promoted, we put him right out on the midnight shift where he basically worked alone. And he was having issues that, like I said, in the aftermath, we were hearing that, there was signs there that we should have picked up on. And we said, we need to do more. Captain Derek Swenson with the police department has a strong interest also in the mental health of our officers, and had suggested that we see if we could bring Aaron on, since he had just gotten his PhD, and say, let's have him work more closely with our people, and that's what we did.
All right. So it kind of was organic, being a pastor, being a mental health provider, also having that interest in working with the police as a first responder. So I'm wondering, just to get into the mind of a police officer, what's it like to be a cop? What does a normal day look like, or how do you walk into your day?
First of all, there is no normal, and there's no regular. Everything's different every single day. And it can be appealing when a person is young and over the length of a career. You don't want the wide range from boredom to sheer terror to be happening. You'd rather it be a little more regular. But one of the things I teach our new officers when we have a new officer academy is some of the research that was done by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. One of the things he talks about is that basically if you would imagine there's like 3 bands. The middle band is normal risk. And anybody that gets up and goes to work in any given day, you may float around within that band. You get ready for work, you do your thing at work, you go to the grocery store, the gym, you come home. For a police officer, they start off that same way, but once they go on shift, they're carrying a gun, they're wearing body armor, they're wearing a visible billboard of who they are and driving one as well. And their job is to go out and be looking for suspicious activity, looking for violations of the law. They may get that radio call where it's a bad domestic and you don't know what's going on. And like I said, sometimes there's kind of feedback through the dispatcher's headset, and you can hear the victim screaming and asking for help, and you don't know what you're going to. So what happens to a police officer then is they're in that upper band of hypervigilance, and that shift may be 8 to 10 hours long. And then when you go home at the end of your shift, Dr. Gilmartin says there's going to be an equalization of that, which means you're going to spend 8 to 12 hours or 8 to 10 hours in the below normal band, which means you're tired, you're detached, you're apathetic, and then who are you with in that time? You're with your family, your spouse, your kids, and you're sitting on the couch and you please leave me alone, and it can lead to problems at home. Mm-hmm. So it's strange because, just a few hours before that, you've gone lights and siren across town to go help a stranger in a bar fight, and then you go home and you don't have time to play with your kids. So you can see it's stressful for when they're at work, and then it can cause problems when they're at home. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do is we want to be providing as much services that we can to the officers and support to them to help them understand that. And that's normal. And there's a way that there's healthy alternatives to being able to deal with that kind of stress and that kind of downtime.
Because that unpredictability just comes with the job, and you just got to be ready. And yet how to recognize what you're feeling, recognize how you're feeling while you're at work and then when you're at home, so that you can respond appropriately in both places. I've got one. I'm not looking at my phone because I'm just interested in what you're saying. But we've been getting some questions from our Facebook watchers. And so from Tim Egebraten, how have the police officers responded to having an in-house mental health professional? Are they receptive to the idea? So you could each answer that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that was really helpful with this position is I had already been around the department for the last 4 years. So I'd already built up relationships with a number of officers there. People have been very responsive. One of the things that I've been doing is I've been working on doing ride-alongs in the last couple of weeks and just hearing people's stories and showing that I'm here to support them in any way I can. And I really care about our police officers, and I really care about their mental health, and I want them to know that I'm here to listen. I'm here to help in any way that I can. So it's also something where I'm just working to slowly integrate myself into the department. And it's helpful to have an office there, and it's right by the mailboxes, so they might stop by and say hello and have a conversation. But again, it's all about relationship. Programs don't help people and change people. Relationships change people and help people. And so that's what I'm really focusing in on right now, especially being new in this position. Working on those relationships is key.
So you're just putting yourself in the middle of the action so that you can be helpful and actually build those relationships, so that maybe people are starting to trust you, so that then you can be helpful when they need it at some point. I'm wondering if you could share, for people who aren't police officers, is there a majority? I'm wondering about the kinds of things you respond to. You mentioned like a domestic abuse situation, a bar fight. Is there what's the highest percentage of calls that police officers get? I think as lay people, we don't necessarily think about what are the most common calls that an officer will get, and some of the most stressful situations for an officer. It would just be helpful to understand those.
I think probably the most common call type would just be ones that are coded as a disturbance, and there are typically a lot of unknowns with those. Is it just that it's a loud TV, or is it that there's some kind of an argument or something going on there, or could it be a party? Sometimes, depending on if it's in an apartment building where there's, multiple people close together, you get more of those kind of calls. And on the flip side of that, sometimes they may know more about what's exactly going on in there based on what they're hearing through the wall versus where it may be a house down the street kind of thing. And, so a lot of those calls, I think, are just disturbance calls, but what they lead to from there is kind of dependent on that set of circumstances. Stress, I think, anytime, they're sent to calls with weapons, that's definitely going to be one that, your mind starts racing and pre-planning, but we do a lot of training for those kind of things. I think the ones that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck is when you hear one of your fellow officers calling for help. You know, they maybe went out on like a disturbance call, and it's something that's turned really ugly really quickly. And they may be outnumbered or overpowered, and they're finally able to get to the radio, and you can hear the stress in their voice. And those are the ones I think that get most officers, because where are they at? How can I get to them? And then, you know, you worry about, you can't help them if you don't get there safely. So, you know, we train people that you're no good if you cause an accident, and now we got to divert some of that help to, you know, come help at the accident as well as that officer calling. But I think those are probably some of the biggest ones.
Is our mental health crises causing some of these disturbances, or how often do you, as officers, come across somebody who's maybe having a mental health crisis?
More and more every year, and that's you know, a nationwide thing. So for us, I think in 2019, we went to ones we would term as a suicidal person call about 600 times, and they seem to go up.
The Moorhead Police Department, 600 times.
Yes.
In 2019.
Yes.
That's a huge number. I think a lot of us are really surprised to hear how big that is.
Yeah, and you know, we've been saying that for a decade already, that there needs to be more mental health services available. You know, a lot of it comes down to available bed space, funding for it. But that's the thing, is we're always the end of the line. We do first aid. We don't do surgery on the street, but we're the ones that respond, do the first aid, and get them into a hospital for surgery. When we respond to a suicidal person and try and get them in for the higher level of care that they need, and if there, you know, isn't options available to them, they're back on the street. And we're the ones that get called the next time again, and the next time, and the next time, because we're not the facility that can turn people away. We're the ones that respond to the call.
And that seems to raise just a bigger structural issue. Right now it is a hot button topic in our whole country of defund the police, or and then also just police reform legislation. If you could, well, there's a number of ways we could go with that question, but one part that I'd like to ask first is if you could wave your magic wand and create a different structure, a different system to help respond to all of the different things that are demanded of police officers, what are some things you would include in restructuring or funding what's most important?
Well, mental health and addiction are probably two of the leading, I guess, causes of us to have repetitive calls to the same people that are not getting better. And they're not going to get better with police response. They get better with addiction counseling and mental health counseling, or medication or treatment of some sort. So if funding is no option, there needs to be more funding available for those services. The issue is it's kind of like a chicken or the egg. I mean, eventually if those calls for service go down because we're funding those other things and there's improvement in our community, there's less need for police, and through attrition we can definitely not be replacing people if the calls for service aren't there. But if you defund the police and you don't have something in place to respond to these situations, you're going to have chaos and mayhem.
And I think that term has kind of added to the division in our country, the division in politics, and there isn't that nuanced understanding of changes in structure rather than just defunding the police. So how have you responded to people who have maybe brought that question to you, should we defund the Moorhead Police?
Well, of course, I would say I don't think you should, but it's not my decision. That's policymaker level decisions. But, you know, I would give that information that I just gave, that who's going to respond to these, because the mental health counselors don't have people out in the field to respond. They, you know, Dr. Aaron here will talk about how many people he's got in his counseling program, and they struggle to fill the needs for counseling positions. But there has been some new things that have been talked about prior to all of this, like co-responder. and even if it's not having somebody ride right within the car and be available 24/7 a day, then is there ways you bring an iPad with you and you can have that person available like in an on-call status to be delivering services to a person in need.
And some of the examples that you've given of being a trained mental health professional, if you're on a ride along and you see somebody who's presenting some mental health crisis, you could be a resource to help get that person the kind of help they need.
Yeah.
Could you share some either examples or how that could be an asset?
Yeah, when I was thinking even just taking a step back too, you talked about the program piece. One thing I think that could be really helpful too is to have kind of a place where it'd be sort of a place for people to go who feel like they need to go somewhere to be safe if they're having a mental health crisis. Because the way things work now is if that person is suicidal with a plan, then you can bring them to the ER. Oh, my phone is talking to me. You can bring them to the ER to be admitted, but a lot of people don't meet that criteria. So what could be sort of that middle ground? Some sort of facility in our community where people could go to feel safe if they're in a mental health crisis. I think that could be a really helpful thing, in terms of developing some kind of program. And then along with like the role that I'm in now, putting more and more counselors in this embedded counselor role as a way to start having police officers and counselors working together, getting used to one another. So I'm already a part of the culture, or the embedded counselor is already a part of the culture. Then it is easier to go on those ride-alongs when a mental health situation comes up. Then I can add some extra information about perhaps what diagnosis that person is going through, and perhaps even help with, if it's a suicide, somebody's having some suicidal ideation, I can go in and help with the suicide assessment. But that trust is already built in because I've already been around the department. I'm working with officers around their mental health and caring for them, and I'm a known entity. And I think that could be potentially a great way of beginning to have police officers and counselors and mental health professionals start working together.
And it's not very common.
No, and it's not common at all. We're probably one of maybe 15 to 20 departments across the country, and it typically is in bigger departments like the Charlotte Police Department, NYPD, the New York Police Department, San Francisco, Grand Rapids, Michigan has an embedded counselor. But I just think it's a great model to start going down this path of bringing police officers and counselors together to be able to provide better services for the community, and especially those who are in mental health crisis, because those calls continue to go up more and more each year. And how can we have police officers and counselors work together? The police officer is the expert when it comes to responding to those calls in the field. So what can we learn from police officers, and what can we do as counselors to help them in that process?
And I saw an example of how useful that would be just in our own life. We had a neighbor who had someone show up in their yard who was lost, disoriented, having some sort of a mental health crisis. And our neighbor knew us and said, could you just come over here and talk to this person and help us out? So we walked down the street and we introduced ourselves, and our neighbors it was great that we knew our neighbors, first of all. I think that's also an issue, that we don't always know our neighbors, so we can't even reach out to neighbors. Right. But then our neighbors were offering this person some water to drink because she appeared dehydrated, and then you started asking some questions to help orient her and try to understand what she might be experiencing. And then you let her know that you would call dispatch and that police officers would come, but yet anything wrong. It wasn't because of criminal behavior. But you helped be a great liaison in that case. So then when the officers came, they were able to know who she was, have the right information, and then they were able to get her home. And that's a situation that it showed how nice things work when you know your neighbors, when you have a mental health professional and the law enforcement all working together. But it also showed that we have such a limited amount of resources. And it would be great if there were more of you and more people like you in that position to help and be a liaison.
And I think Mother Teresa said the problem with the world is we've forgotten we belong to each other. And that's a great example of, remembering that we all belong to each other, we're all connected, we can all help each other out, and ended up working out very well. And the officers did a great job with her when they came on scene.
And I'm wondering now in the time of COVID, everything is more complicated now. But I'm also wondering, have you noticed an increase in suicides or suicide attempts because of loneliness, isolation, people not being connected to the resources they need?
Yeah, it's strange. We're doing a lot less proactive work just to not have contact with people because of COVID. And so our call numbers are down overall, the numbers of the calls, but all of our serious crime numbers are up. That's called Part 1 crimes. Part 2 crimes, most of those are up as well, which seems strange because fewer call numbers but higher crime.
What is a Part 1 crime? What's a Part 2 crime?
Your murder, robbery, rape kind of thing is your Part 1, and then your Part 2 are more like your assaults, theft, those things.
Okay.
But then along those same lines is those suicidal calls. Those have been climbing year after year after year. We go up 50 to 100 calls per year over the last 5 years, because I think it was about 300 and some calls we went on for suicide calls 5 years ago, and last year we were around 600. So they've doubled in that time.
Well, and that's got to take a toll on police officers. Entering those scenes, I mean, they're prepared to, assess a scene, but yet to see someone who is dying or who has died, that's got to take a toll. So maybe you both could respond to how that's come up.
I've got a good example. One of the focuses I had in becoming the chief was being able to attract and retain staff. And, our recruiting efforts have been positive. We're still finding good candidates out there. We had a young lady that went to school right here at MSUM for criminal justice. She got on with the department, fantastic employee who just flew through our training program. So we run at about 40% that don't make it through training. So it's difficult because it's a tough job. But she did a fantastic job. In her first 4 months out on the road on her own, she handled 9 completed suicide calls. 4 of those were death by hanging. Wow. And I've got, 28 years in law enforcement, I've probably been to 4 in 28 years, I know some of my guys might be watching and they're saying, well, yeah, you've been in office as chief or deputy chief for a few years. True. But still, that is a lot to see. And right away, that was my concern. How do I retain this employee? How do they not go home and go, I'm not sure this is the job for me? And that's where we turned it over to Aaron to say, can you make that connection and talk with this employee?
And how are some ways you've been helpful for officers who it takes a toll, the things that they see in their everyday work?
Yeah, the first thing is I'm going to be working with the new officers in their training academy, and so I'll be doing that in a couple of days here, where we'll talk a little bit about how our bodies respond to stress and what that's like. And along with that, things like mindfulness, being able to name what they're feeling. Whenever we can name what we're feeling and experiencing, we can have control to a certain degree over those emotions, labeling them, doing other things to calm our bodies down when we experience stress. Things like tactical breathing, which is a way of breathing in and out slowly to help slow down your body and slow down that stress response. So we're trying to be proactive in talking about stress and what that's like to go in to a traumatic situation, what you'll feel and what you'll see, what you'll smell, all of those different things. So we're being proactive, but then also I'll be available to debrief difficult calls. So if an officer wants to talk with me and talk about what they saw, I'll be able to help with that. In this role, I won't be doing any formal counseling, but will be available for officers for a couple of different sessions to debrief difficult situations, whether it's on the job or at home or wherever it may be. And we also have an EAP program, so I can help be a bridge between the department and the EAP program as well. And we also have a debriefing team as well. It's called PART, so Peer Assistance Response Team. And so I've helped out with that. And so we've had a number of officers that have gone through a 2-day training with a traumatologist about how to do debriefing with a critical incident. And so that's available for officers as well. And there's kind of 2 different levels. There's a defusing, which is a shorter sort of debriefing and not quite the official debriefing process that you go through. And then there's a more extensive debrief process, which gets all of the people involved in whatever the critical incident may be and have conversation about that and help support one another as well. So helping to facilitate that peer support is another important part of this role, and caring for each other, knowing that they're all in this together. And those can be really powerful experiences to see officers debriefing these difficult situations that they go through.
Well, I would imagine that would be helpful to just get some of this stuff off your chest so you don't have to take it home with you. Or if there's a situation at home, a safe place to get that off your chest so then you can also do your job better. To just be able to have those appropriate places to share that you know that it will be held in confidence and it can help you function better in both areas of your life. I've got another question. This one is from Alan Brooks, a pastor. He says, a pastor like myself is required only a once-a-career mental evaluation before we begin. As a fellow community leader, I would think both of our professions should have these required periodically throughout our careers. Would such a requirement hopefully catch the bad apples, or would the requesting of more mental health evaluations be received poorly? So there's kind of a number of things in the question, but what are your thoughts about periodic, well, either assessments or evaluations or check-ins?
Yeah, well, I feel like we're taking it a step further and just embedding it into the culture, where I'm available to have conversations and talk, because your information is only as good as what the person is reporting to you. Again, it goes back to the relationship piece. The more that I can get to know officers and work with them, do ride-alongs, be with them side by side, my hope is that some of that will just happen organically in a role like this. And I think that's the beauty of this embedded counselor role. Is it's not somebody from the outside coming in and doing evaluation. I don't think that would work very well. But for me just to be a part of the culture and I care about you. I care about the work that you do. I care about your families. I want to be here to support you. I think that's where a role like this could be really beneficial for officers. And my hope would be more and more police departments would have something like this.
Yeah, an embedded person rather than a program.
Right, and so I feel like it takes it one step further.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would use the analogy of like the carrot or the stick.
Yeah.
And they're both can be applicable in the right situation. And I think we are better off doing the carrot, getting people to want to come and be healthier and be fixing this along the way and giving them the tools they need along the way, rather than going, here at this periodic thing, let's bring you in and have an adversarial conversation, evaluate you and determine whether or not you're going to still have a job or not. I'd rather just say, let's stay healthy throughout the year, every year.
And virtually on day one, they're getting that message, when I go and talk to the new academy, we're going to talk about your mental health. We're going to talk about caring for yourself, because they're using their selves as instruments to help other people. And so they need to take care of themselves. They're the most important tool in the tool belt, is their use of self. And so we're going to talk about that from day one.
And that seems so intuitive and so obvious, but yet I think so many of us forget that. If we're not a healthy person, it's hard to help other people be healthy and help them as well. We've got a question from Scott Gieselhart. Please explain crisis intervention team training and how more funding would help train more officers about mental health and how they could better assess the mental health crisis calls.
We have a goal that all of our officers would be trained in CIT, crisis intervention training. With the amount, when you have retiring and, people coming and going, not making it through training, you get behind that. But I would estimate we're maybe in about that 70-80% of our department is trained in it. So it's something that we want on board with all of our staff. But what that's for is being able to go to a call like what you just mentioned with your neighbor had called because the strange person had come to their yard, is whatever they're being presented with, to be able to try and quickly see what kind of crisis this person might be in, and how can you be sure to diffuse it if it's something that looks like they're being potentially violent or adversarial, and try and get them safely to the services that they need. So it's just about identifying the behaviors and what may be threatening or not threatening, and then being able to diffuse it properly and get them off to the help that they need.
And the CIT training is pretty extensive. It's 40 hours, it's a week, right? And a lot of the trainings, they hire actors, professional actors, to come in to play the role of somebody, experiencing some sort of mental health crisis. And so the training is really quite remarkable. And I think originally, was it the Memphis model, or it came out of the Memphis Police Department? Yes. And it can be very effective to experience firsthand what it's like to do those diffusings, or what it's like to work with somebody who's in crisis.
I've got someone kind of asking the flip side of it being helpful. Martin Avery asks, is there a reluctance to talk to someone who's in-house with fear of getting word around? I understand the confidentiality, but perceptions can be different. So maybe people being afraid to talk because they think word would get around, that they're seeking help.
Sure.
No, Dr. Aaron's role is really that bridge. I mean, the city has an employee assistance program, but it's a big jump for somebody to drive across town, make an appointment, sit in the lobby and wait, and then have a complete stranger. And then we're a little bit unique because of the job that we do and the things that we see. So he really serves as that bridge, because he's there, he's done ride-alongs, he's been a chaplain with us for 4 years already. He's got those relationships established. And he's not the one that's sitting down doing full sessions with these people. He's there to help them out. He's there to give them suggestions, and I shouldn't speak for you. I'll let you fill that in.
Yeah.
But he's that bridge to get them to other services. And there's a saying that I caught at a training that I think is dead on, is that a police officer will put their life on the line for somebody else, but they'll die before they ask for help for themselves. And this is what I'm hoping does it. And the numbers show. I mean, there was 120 line of duty deaths already this year. There was 147 all of last year. And there's usually 2 to 3 times that in suicides per year. And that's what we want to avoid. In my time, I've lost 2 close friends to suicide in area departments here. And I don't want that to happen with our staff.
Well, and we're focusing our conversation on mental health. But, as you said, like, your body is your instrument. And if our police officers can stay healthy, that may also help with some of the other issues that are confronting policing right now, and some of the distrust that's in our community and in other communities, especially in policing with communities of color, and there not being that trust there. And then if you're already unhealthy in caring for yourself, you're not going to be able to be as empathetic to engage in a situation with somebody from a community that's different than yours. So how could tending to mental health help our officers as they're engaging with people who have historically and currently still don't trust police officers?
There's a lot in that question.
There's a lot. I mean, but just by looking at it from the mental health angle, how can we help address racism, distrust, community building? So whatever one of those you want to take.
The simplest thing, when we bring on new people, and it's a word that's right in our mission statement, is to treat all people with dignity. And I stress that because it doesn't matter who they are. I even use the example. I don't care if you go down to Steve Shields' house and you're communicating with him, or if you're dealing with a homeless person on the street. Treat everybody with dignity, and you will not go wrong. Now, there's a lot of other issues that come around when we talk about race issues. Why doesn't the department reflect the way the community looks? Those are some bigger issues that are beyond the department, because I can only hire those that have the educational requirements and the licensure. So it's what's out there that's applying for us that has that. So we've taken a stance of how can we grow our own. So we're trying to, we use our SROs in the schools. We have a police athletics and activities league where we do Shop with a Cop, a Giving Tree of Hope, and we bring, a police Santa Claus goes to the homeless shelter and brings gifts to the kids. We've given almost 50 bikes away that we've fixed up, or along with a partnership with Shields, to try and build some of those bonds with our communities, and especially in the schools, because we think if we can gain that trust with our new Americans and our communities of color when they're young, that we're going to have a better future. But racism is an issue, and it's something that we have to face. And one thing I think we are so fortunate for is that in this difficult time that we're in, we've really been blessed with having Mayor Judd as our leader, because he gets it. He's been a public defender. He's been a prosecuting attorney. He works in diversity and inclusion, and he's a great leader who brings people together and really talks against the divisive stuff that's going on in our society. So it is great to have as our city leader.
Well, and one of the hopes that I mentioned at the beginning of our time is bringing nuance to the things that we're really struggling with in our country. We're very politically divided. There's not a lot of trust across the aisle between races. And yet, if we can find ways to look at the whole bigger system rather than just pinning it all on the police, because what we see is the police are kind of that only place people can call for all sorts of things, from criminal things to non-criminal things. And that's a huge burden and weight and responsibility to place all on our police officers. But I think if we can then understand and empathize with what you're carrying, and then realize that racism is just embedded in our whole culture. It's not just something we pin on the police, but yet we say, this is difficult. It's hard to find ways to build trust. It's hard to build community. And so the reason this topic seems so important to us here at church is if we can address mental health, if we can help people be healthy in themselves, maybe they're more likely to be empathetic to someone else whose experience they don't understand. If you understand yourself, you can probably understand other people as well. So my hope is that we can create these bridges. You're creating a bridge in the police department, but I also wonder as Christians, how can we be good neighbors? At the beginning, I said our call is to try to be the kind of neighbor that Jesus would ask us to be. And so I don't know, what do you think our residents, the citizens of Moorhead, how can we help partner with you? How can we be good neighbors to our police officers? How can we help create bridges between the police community and the rest of the community? There's a lot in there too, but just how can we be those neighbors? Just average people in Moorhead.
Back to that, just treat everybody with dignity, everybody. And I think that if you were to take anybody and mix people together and they actually get to know each other and like Dr. Aaron says, hear each other's stories, you gain some understanding of that other person. So you will never be able to fully put yourself in their shoes, because I won't know what it's like to be a person of color that walks into a store and maybe you see, people follow you around, or they look at you with fear in their eyes over color or something, I won't know that feeling. Mm-hmm. But I think if we come together as a community and we have the discussion and we try to gain understandings of each other, that we're going to lower that barrier that we've got between us. And the nasty, divisive commentary on social media or what we see in the regular media, we should shut that off, and we should look at our community and at our neighbors and try and treat each other better.
And I like what Mayor Judd said last month. He said, we can believe that Black Lives Matter and we can be supportive of our police officers. I think there's just so much more nuance and understanding that we could all have. I'm wondering if each of you have a question that you wish I would have asked, or a hope, or just something that needs to be said.
Yeah, I was going to go off of, kind of riff on that idea of neighbor and story. One of my favorite quotes by Father Greg Boyle is to be in awe of what people carry rather than stand in judgment of how they carry it. I think that's such a powerful thing to be able to hear your neighbor's stories and just to listen to understand rather than listen to respond. Just hear each other's stories. Where I really discovered the power of that was in Chicago. I remember hearing the story of this young boy, person of color, 14 years old, south side of Chicago. He had come into our ER because he had been shot and was talking to him. And he just shared all sorts of really interesting stories and heard about what life was like on the south side of Chicago in his kind of 6-block square that he lived in. And somehow we got to talking about Lake Michigan. And he had never seen Lake Michigan, even though it was only like 2 miles away. And all of a sudden, it was like we were connected. It was sort of my story was woven into his story. And I think that's really important to remember, that we're all deeply connected in this world. And I think we're called to hear each other's stories and to listen to understand rather than listen to respond.
And I think that's a message Christians need to hear too, about to see what people carry and stand in awe of them and what other people carry rather than stand in judgment. Because I think when Christians are at their least healthy,
right,
that's when the judgment is present.
Well, and that's Christ's prayer for us, that they all may be one.
What's another, or a question as we're kind of wrapping things up that you think is important to lift up tonight?
We brought in a training here about a year ago. It was Clark and Tracy Paris, and he was a retired officer from Las Vegas Metro, and then his wife was an ER nurse. And they travel all over the world putting on trainings for law enforcement. A lot of it's based on suicide prevention with police officers. But a stat he brought in is that through the full vetting process to become a police officer, the educational requirements, the psychological, the medical exam, the application process, you name it, through all of that, those ones that get on and hired with a given agency are in the least likely group to ever get a DUI, to ever be involved in domestic violence, to be heavy users of drugs or alcohol. And at the end of their career, they're in the highest group.
Wow. So
what is going on over that time frame that changes that person from where they were to what they become over this career? And I'm not an expert in that field, but you have to say it's the exposure to what they see over that career. And that's why I think we have the great fortune of having Dr. Aaron with us, is that we're hoping to change the course of that over the future in our agency.
And I see that having benefits into the whole community. Because as you said at the beginning, police officers are very public. When they are on duty, you know it's a police officer. The way you dress, the way you drive around, you can't hide. And so to be able to embody that role in the healthiest way possible just has to have really impactful, powerful, positive implications in the whole rest of the community.
Yeah, and they weren't some aliens that were dropped in here on Earth and do policing job. They were somebody's son, daughter, spouse, brother, sister. They're just an average, regular person that's doing this job.
Well, I hope that we can continue to find ways to be a bridge in this community for one another. And I'm thankful for having you as our leader of our Moorhead Police Department, really engaging, caring for your officers in a really meaningful way. And I hope that more people will be inspired to try to enter into a kind of relationship with police departments here in our area, but this seems like a great model that could spread throughout the country too. So if you want to put in a pitch for recruiting more counselors, people,
We need counselors. In our community right now, most agencies are booking out 2 months. And as mental health issues continue to climb, more and more crises out there, we need counselors. And so And that's my other job, is training counselors. So I feel very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, and very grateful for my work in teaching new counselors, but then also very grateful for my work at the police department as well. It's an absolute honor.
And I also we could put out a recruiting pitch for great, bright people to enter into law enforcement as well, because I understand that that's a huge need too.
Absolutely. So, and with everything you're seeing going on in the media, the need's going to be greater here going into the future, that we not only have people that are applying, but the right people.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for joining us in this evening where we're trying to figure out how to care for the mental health of our police officers. And at Good Shepherd, we're also in the middle of a sermon series called More Than a Feeling, where we're looking at our emotional and mental health and how God has created us with these emotions. And God gives us resources to help us figure out how to manage our emotions, how to be healthy in our emotional and mental health. And so I really would lift up to all of you to pray for our law enforcement community, to pray for their health and well-being so that they can be the best officers that they can be. And also pray for those in the mental health profession as well. And I also hope that as community members, we could learn to trust one another, respond to each person that we meet in our own neighborhoods with dignity. And that's difficult now in the time of COVID, but yet it has never been more important that we care for one another deeply in this community. And I hope that conversations like this one can help us to find that empathy, to see that dignity, and that we will hold one another in prayer. So that's my hope for us tonight. I hope that you'll tune in for our next Leading the Conversation in August. Thanks for joining us.